Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Aubrey Reeves, CEO of Business and Arts. Before we begin, I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am a white settler speaking to you from Takaranto. I have the honor to be a guest on the traditional lands and waters of the Petun and Wendat peoples and the Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee confederacies, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River, as well as many other Indigenous nations, some of whose names are no longer remembered. By saying the names of its original keepers, we remember that this territory continues to be subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Three Fires Confederacy of the Anishinaabeg to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We acknowledge all who came before us and have traveled the lands and waters of this territory. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work, to live, and to meet on these lands. We also acknowledge that colonialism and inequality is not a thing of the past, but continues to impact and shape the lives of individuals and communities today. This includes not just Indigenous peoples, but many groups such as Black and racialized people, newcomers, deaf and disabled people, LGBTQ2S plus low-income households, and others who do not have equal access to services, resources, and opportunities in our society. As we enter year 2 of the pandemic, these inequities have become ever more visible in the way the pandemic continues to affect our lives and our society. As such, Business and Arts is committed to making our programs and events accessible and responsive to the needs of the diverse communities within the arts. Undoubtedly, this is a difficult time for the arts sector, especially with it coming just as we were starting to see companies reopen and relaunch seasons this fall. Statistics Canada just released the National Cultural Indicators for the third quarter of 2021, and in it we can see a small but encouraging rise in GDP and job numbers in the culture sector for that period. Unfortunately, that was before Omicron. And for many, the new wave and closures in some provinces have really felt like a sucker punch. If there's any silver lining, it is that through sessions like today's, we're able to come together to collectively assess the situation, to commiserate, and to learn from each other's experiences and insight, so that when we're able to reopen again, we'll be ready and better equipped for a stronger recovery in the arts. Today's session is the 7th installment of the Arts Response Tracking Survey, a partnership between Business and Arts, the National Arts Centre, and Nanos Research, which provides the arts sector with a deeper understanding of Canadians' attitudes on returning to indoor and outdoor arts and cultural events across Canada. This survey was first in the field in late November, just as news of Omicron was beginning to emerge, and given the rapid escalation of the case numbers around the world, we decided to run the same survey questions a second time in late December to ensure we were capturing the quickly shifting context. Nik's presentation includes the December data, but the report, which is now available in both English and French on our website, includes both sets of data gathered about 1 month apart. I'd like to thank Nanos Research for their continued hard work on the arts project, and founding partner, National Arts Centre, for their continued support and commitment. I'd also like to thank supporters David Bennett and NAC Foundation donors Irfan Raji and Christine Armstrong. This webinar is also included in the monthly Business and Arts speaker series, so I'd like to thank the series presenting partner, Power Corporation of Canada, and supporting partner, Manulife Financial. A few small housekeeping items before we really get going. We're happy to have ASL interpreters Nik and Dean from Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service with us here today. Just a reminder to our speakers and to myself to please slow down for our interpreters so they can catch everything we're saying. Auto-generated English captions can also be turned on. Also, only the presenters and moderators will have our microphones on today, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and you can vote for the ones you think are most relevant. The session is scheduled for 1 hour and 15 minutes to give us ample time for questions. We're starting today's session with a presentation by Nik Nanos. Nik is Chief Data Scientist and founder of Nanos Research, one of Canada's most distinguished research companies. Nik is the official pollster for CTV News, the Globe and Mail, and Bloomberg News in Canada. He is also a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and a research professor at the State University of New York, and is the past chair of Carleton University's Board of Governors. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nick.
Thanks, Aubrey, and hello, everyone. It's happy to join and to share the latest round of research. I'm going to share my screen with the data. Couple things, as Aubrey mentioned, the regular tracking was scheduled for November, but because of the changes related to Omicron, we decided collectively that we would go into the field in December. So this particular wave, which was completed just before the holiday season, and I think on the 22nd or 23rd of December, includes Omicron. But obviously, it doesn't reflect what's happened, at least in the last 3 weeks or thereabouts. The other thing is, as Aubrey mentioned, please go to the Business and Arts website to download this data, this report, and also the report from the November wave of research. And before I dig in, one last thing, please post your questions that you have related to the research in the chat/question box, and I will be happy to respond live as we go through this session, the rest of the webinar. So, as you can see, the fixation that we have now is on Omicron and basically fear of the virus and the impact of the virus returning. And I think it would be fair to say, and Aubrey did mention this, it's been quite a roller coaster ride. Everything seems to be changing almost week by week, month by month when it comes to the pandemic. And what's happened, at least for now, is that what looked like a positive potential trajectory in the latter part of 2021 has basically been a step back, so to speak. So I'm not going to read the legalese related to the methodology. That's in the report. But I think one of the key things that we see, at least, is culture goers much more likely to cite the number of cases as one of the key factors that would make them feel more comfortable in coming back. And the fact of the matter is that when we look at the tracking data, this really wasn't very much on the agenda compared to the past. In the past, tended to focus a little more on vaccinations and mask wearing and stuff like that. Now think of it as a fixation on the case count. I think the good news is that as soon as the case counts start to subside, which they will, that would be a leading indicator in terms of increasing comfort in coming back for people to enjoy all the arts and culture activities that they want to come back to. The other piece of good news is that, at least compared to back in May 2021, when we look at the return to in-person events, still a positive trajectory on this on this particular measure, where you can see 1/3 of culture goers say that they've already returned to visiting museums or to outdoor events, and still 1/4 are reporting that they've already returned to indoor events. And I'd always kind of say it in this particular context, it's always the first step that's probably the most difficult for individuals, and that what we saw, at least in the fall, was an increasing number of culture goers making that first step. And I think for many of them, we're hoping that they would be able to take the second step in January, at least, but that they'll probably have to wait, at least for a certain period of time, before they can continue to kind of re-engage and enjoy the arts and culture organizations that they love. And as you know, this is a tracking survey. So these are the tracking questions. And every wave, we try to do a special topic. In this particular wave, what we wanted to unpack was, I'll call relative risk or relative safety. And what we wanted to do was to get a sense on how culture goers felt about how safe or unsafe they felt going to an arts and cultural event compared to two other types of events, one being a sit-down restaurant, the other one being a live indoor sporting event. And what you can see at least is that when we look at live indoor sporting events, that culture goers are much more likely to think that going to a live indoor cultural event is safer than going to a live sporting event. You can see the differential between those that think that it's less safe, only 8%, compared to 47% who think that it is safer. The differential is significant. People still think that going to a sit-down restaurant is more likely to be safe than less safe compared to an indoor culture event, but the difference on that front is less striking than an indoor live sporting event. So this isn't to diminish any of these other activities, but to basically provide context in terms of the level of safety and how safe and more safe people feel going to an indoor arts or cultural event compared to either a sit-down restaurant or an indoor live sporting event. We've been tracking kind of obstacles to participation, and two key takeaways here. On the right-hand side, those are the mentions that are outside of the control of cultural organizations, that there really hasn't been any material change in some of those obstacles that are outside the control of the sector. However, you can see that the fear of being exposed to the virus, the difference between November and December, just 4 weeks, is actually significant. And this has to do with the pretty quick spread of the Omicron virus. The other measures in terms of potential obstacles remain the same, but the concern about being exposed to the virus is actually much higher. And we know from the other research that we've done, and I'm sure everyone on the call knows anecdotally, that it just seems that people are more likely to know someone that's been infected with Omicron compared to previous variants. And I think that's probably drives why at least culture goers right now, when we think of potential obstacles, they're thinking about the possibility of being exposed to the virus. So I'm not going to read this in detail, but the key takeaways is that perceptions related to being exposed is the key obstacle right now. It's not vaccinations, and it's not right now. Comparative safety, indoor arts and cultural events on a comparative safety perspective do much better, especially compared to live indoor sporting events. Vaccinations and social distancing continue to be important, but people are focusing on the case count and reported attendance, at least compared between November and December and the previous waves in May, still trending up, but obviously probably on pause right now until we are allowed or can normalize a little more. So with that, I'm going to throw it back, and I will now transition over to the chat bot to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nick. That was a great summary of the research, and yes, everyone can find the full report on our website. As he said, if you have technical questions about the data or methodology, Nick will answer that in the Q&A box while we go through our discussion. So now I'd like to introduce our three wonderful panelists who will give us their take on the research findings. First off, joining us from Toronto is Belinda Bale, who has worked in the performing arts for over 25 years. She currently serves as the Director of Marketing and Communications for the National Ballet of Canada, where she oversees the company's communications and marketing initiatives for both single ticket and subscription campaigns, achieving revenues of over 13 million per season. Belinda has managed campaigns for the world premieres of work by Christopher Weldon, Alexei Ratmansky, and Crystal Pite, among others. And Belinda also served as Director of Marketing Communications for Soul Pepper Theatre Company, overseeing all marketing initiatives for the company's full year subscription season, as well as the launch of music and family programming at the Young Center for the Performing Arts. Belinda has been a speaker at the Capacity Interactive's Digital Marketing Bootcamp for the Arts in New York and the Arts Reach Conference in Toronto. She was born in London, England, but Belinda studied theatre production at Ryerson University in Toronto. So welcome to Belinda. Our second guest is Alex Sarian, who's joining us from Calgary. In May 2020, Alex was appointed president and CEO of Arts Commons, making him responsible for the third largest art center in Canada, which is home to 6 resident companies and over 200 community groups who access it regularly. Occupying over 560,000 square feet in downtown Calgary, the Arts Common complex normally welcomes about 600,000 visitors to its 2,000 events every year, and features rehearsal studios, production workshops, education spaces, art galleries, restaurants, public community areas, and 6 performance venues. So it's a lot going on in that space. Since beginning his tenure, Alex has led Arts Commons' response to the COVID pandemic, including the development of free outdoor and digital programming, the creation of an Indigenous strategic plan, and an unprecedented investment in digital and accessibility infrastructure, and launched a $450 million expansion and modernization campaign, all while retaining 93% of their staff and increasing contributed revenues. Alex is originally from Toronto. He's lived in Buenos Aires for 15 years before moving to New York in 2002, where he held leadership positions at a variety of arts institutions, including the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. And our third esteemed guest is Sandra Larron. Sandra is from the Temi Ogama Anishinaabe people of the Deep Waters in Temagami, Northern Ontario, and is based in Toronto, where she is the executive and artistic director of Red Sky Performance. Sandra is a highly accomplished arts leader, innovator, and creator who for more than 3 decades has played a pivotal role in the ongoing Indigenous culture resurgence in Canada and beyond. Active in diplomacy, Sandra has represented Canada at international platforms, including Unceded Voices at the Venice Biennale, 2 cultural Olympiads, Canadian Heritage's first creative and industries trade mission to China in 2018, and a 2022 trade mission to Europe. From 2007 to 2016, Sandra was the Director of Indigenous Arts at the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, and she also currently serves on the inaugural board of TO Live Foundation, the TELUS Community Fund Foundation, Temagami Community Foundation, Verity Circle on TRC, and the steering committee of this CSC Global Leaders to build leadership capacity across the Commonwealth. And this year, Sandra is also a participant in Business and Arts Executive Leadership Programs. So welcome to Sandra, Alex, and Belinda. Today, we're talking about many different kinds of risks. First, there's the risks that audiences may perceive that they face when attending the arts, which Nik touched on in the data, some that we can mitigate and some that we can't. And then there's the financial risks that arts organizations are facing due to closures and lost revenues. And our artists and staff are all facing potential health risks. So finally, there's also the risk ahead of us to reopen and to rebuild. But let's get started with our recent experiences. First, Sandra, I wanted to ask you about Red Sky Performance was on a North American tour throughout the fall during a hopeful phase of the pandemic, and when there was minimal restrictions that varied from place to place. Can you reflect for a moment on how audiences were responding to your tour in different locations?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Aubrey. So as we went across Turtle Island, Canada, and the US, I have to say we were met with so much enthusiasm, and everybody, all the audiences just seemed so emotional and grateful. We were very fortunate, as Aubrey had indicated, that we were sort of in between the valley of COVID-19 and before Omicron hit. Right in there, we squeezed in a 3-month tour across Canada and the United States. Having said that, when we first started out, there was a hurricane and a tornado out east, and then the pandemic in between, and it ended with a mudslide and flooding in BC. So all of us unscathed, all of us have a story to tell, but it was really an emotional time in a lot of ways on behalf of the audiences. My general observation is that venues have restricted numbers, government directives, and in many places we had checkerboard seating, which means that they're at 50% capacity. And in some cases, we were allowed to go up to 75% capacity. And in other places, it was business as usual. So that was really interesting. Like in Dance House, we moved up to 75% capacity in Vancouver because things were going well. In Arizona, you had to really, I know the presenters were basically begging people to wear masks. And so that was really interesting. We were on a dude ranch in Arizona as part of our tour with like about 40 horses. And it was just incredible to be in that sort of environment at that time. Washington, they were super diligent and very controlling the capacity, et cetera, et cetera. So, and in some places, there was one venue, I can't remember which one now, they actually wanted the dancers to wear a mask the entire time of dancing, which we tried to do, and the audience was at least 25 feet away. Like there's a great big, chunk of distance between the audience and the performers, but the mask fell off halfway through because if you've ever seen our shows, it's very, very physical. I would say the audience was, anywhere between cautious engagement, wearing masks, and some people just bunkering down at home and not going out at all, to people being really, really emotional and excited and being out there. A lot of the venues also added digital online performances that then were streamed and ticketed. So some of them did add that as a sort of an ancillary or a value-added sort of presentation. But we had an incredible time, really. Lots of testing and all of that, but it was great. Thank you.
Wow, that sounds like a pretty remarkable experience that you'll always remember, I think. So Alex, in Alberta, Arts Commons has not been subject to recent closures, but you do have to follow the restriction exemption program. As the largest performing arts center in Western Canada, you present your own programming as well as host 6 resident companies. So there's a lot of things happening in your space, as well as galleries. So throughout the fall and now into the winter, based on that experience, what trends are you noticing in audience behavior?
Absolutely. Thank you, Aubrey, and greetings, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm joining you from Treaty 7 territory out here in Calgary. One of the things that I find very interesting is that for the past 18 months, the arts sector across North America has been saying to people, has been warning people, this is not going to be a flipping of the switch, a return to a new normal. And so what's interesting to me is that in hindsight, it was almost, and I feel very strange saying this, it was almost easier to live with the inconvenience or devastation of being shut down than it is with the ambiguity of what reopening looks like. And so as I look at who's on the call, and as I know that we are all struggling right now in a way that we haven't over the past 18 months, I just want to remind ourselves that we have been warning ourselves that this time would come, and that we knew it wasn't going to be easy. Aubrey, to answer your question, one of the things that I've shared with my staff and people that have worked around me, and I've been saying it jokingly, I've been quoting a lot of Jurassic Park in the sense that just because we can doesn't mean we should. So it has been an amazing opportunity for the arts community in Calgary, and certainly those that are whose home base is within Arts Commons. It's been an incredible opportunity for us to come together and say, yes, there are these provincial programs and protocols and policies, but do we want to go a step above and beyond? And what does that look like? Because we know our audience is better than anybody else. And what does it look like for 6 resident companies to come together and say, this is what we believe a unified patron experience should look like? One of the things that, and you started by sharing how big Arts Commons is, the other thing that's unique is that we have a variety of venue sizes. So we have everything from a 50-person black box to an 1,800-person concert hall and everything in between. So we've had the luxury of being able to modify different shows for different spaces, so that perhaps if there are people that feel comfortable going to a rock concert with 1,000 of their closest friends, we could do that safely. But for those that want to enjoy jazz in the comfort of a 100-person black box at cabaret tables, we could do that as well. There's no one size fits all, and that's what we've been learning. But I think we can be consistent in terms of how we are treating our audiences. So that's really something I've noticed in terms of the behaviors and trends of arts organizations. In terms of audience trends, I think all of us on this call are used to selling shows. We've never really had to interface with consumer confidence from a health and safety perspective in the way that we are now. I've never had to go to a public and say that Arts Commons has MERV 15 air filters and ultraviolet germicidal irradiation systems. Nobody teaches you that at art school. But to be able to say that sitting in Arts Commons is the same health experience as sitting in the waiting room of an emergency hospital room because of the air filtration, that is tapping into consumer confidence in a way that we've never had to use that argument before. So we're not just selling shows anymore, we're selling the experience and the safety of that experience. And I think as we come out of COVID, and I think, to Nik's point earlier, this is the beginning of us reemerging, and we don't know how long it'll take, but at least there is movement now, whereas the past 18 months has been pretty stagnant. We find ourselves having to talk about an artistic experience in ways that we've never had to before. And so I think that is challenging, but it's also incredibly exciting because it opens the door for us to now talk about the value of the arts. It is a healthy experience. We are building community after a year of isolation. So the challenge, I think, is an incredible opportunity for the arts sector to reposition its value to society as the world has changed and as people's expectations are changing of us.
That's a really interesting point. It is quite a paradigm shift for the way we're presenting the arts. So Belinda, the National Ballet of Canada was one of the first major companies to get back on stage in Toronto this fall with a mixed program in November. It was followed by the Nutcracker in December, which unfortunately did not get to have its full run. Can you walk us through the ups and downs of the National Ballet's experience with its return to stage, and tell us what lessons we can all take from this roller coaster ride you were on?
Yes, it was a roller coaster, Aubrey. Thank you, and hello, everyone. I would say, firstly, I have never done so many budget projections in my life, budgeting for every single scenario, and I never want to hear the word pivot ever again. So there have been many, many hours that we spent looking at every possible outcome because there was such uncertainty of what capacities would be. And we also had many, many hours, just as Alex was talking about it, to really clearly communicate what the safety protocols were. And also to work really closely with our colleagues at the Four Seasons Center to manage the patron experience of how do we manage everybody coming in, the vaccine checks, the ID checks, the tests for kids, and just the amount of people coming in and with all of those checks and making it a smooth experience. And I will say they did an incredible job. So for the National Ballet of Canada, what we normally do in the fall is we have a mixed program and a full length. And this year, because of the effect of the lockdown on our rehearsal schedule, we decided to just do one production. So the mixed program. Normally we would have 6 or 7 performances of a mixed program and then a longer run of the full length. So we decided to do 13 performances of Angel's Atlas. And if any of you have seen this production, you'll know why. Karen Kane, our former artistic director, said all the way along, whenever the National Ballet of Canada gets back on stage, this is the ballet we're going to perform. We premiered this work literally right before the pandemic hit. It premiered on February 29th. And I think Crystal Pike kind of knew something because this work is all about human connection. It's about the ephemerality of life. And it's stunningly beautiful. And Karen was determined that that's what we would have when we returned. So we created a program of Angel's Atlas with George Balanchine's Serenade. And instead of intermission, we showed a film of Soul, which is a beautiful piece of choreography by Jara Wolf, who is Red Sky's associate artist. Wonderful piece. And when we were projecting, we had all kinds of scenarios. And then eventually when we kind of went on sale, it was a 50% capacity. So we were all ready for 50% capacity, making sure we moved our subscribers around and that we had enough for single tickets. And then on October 8th, Premier Ford in Ontario opened up capacity to full capacity. So it was kind of yet again another pivot. However, for us, what we thought, just to be able to manage the amount of people, we did keep Ring 5 closed. So we had generally about 60 to 65% capacity throughout the run for Angels Atlas, which was manageable for the staff at the Four Seasons Center, but yet made it feel very full. And again, back to how hard it is to project. This production actually is the highest performing mixed program ever to happen in the history of the National Ballet of Canada, as far as revenue. It did very well last time, and this time it exceeded projections by 400,000. And I will echo what Sandra said about the feeling in the audience. That opening night, we opened with Serenade, which has this incredible opening tableau of dancers with one hand looking out to the moon, and people would not stop applauding. The dancers just had to hold and hold and hold. And it was wonderful. It just made you realize this is why we do what we do. It was such a beautiful experience. And to see that response, and it was not just out front, it was backstage. The dancers literally were in tears. They were so happy to be back on stage. And it really showed what we've been through this last, I don't know, 2 years now. So Angels Atlas was such a success. And then we went into Nutcracker. Again, 100% capacity. I had projected Nutcracker at about 70% capacity originally, because I thought there would be more audience hesitancy, and also because we were asking that all kids under 12 needed to show a negative COVID test. So we thought this would have an impact, because that's a bit of a hassle. I did reduce the price of all children's tickets for Nutcracker by the cost of the test, which was $40, but still they had to go through this. And we did have some kids showing up with no tests, but we did decide to have somebody on site that did a rapid test, because after one show, I was like, I cannot be on the desk seeing a little girl in her velvet dress with her patent leather shoes and turn her away because she doesn't have a test. So we did have somebody doing those tests. But again, the audience surprised us, and that it sold far ahead of our projection. And when we went into the opening night, we were kind of on track to be a normal Nutcracker, which would have been around 95 to 97% capacity. Then on December 15th, Premier Doug Ford announced, it was actually a surprise announcement, we were expecting it a little bit later, that there would be 50% capacity as of Saturday. So you can imagine we had a whole bunch of sold out shows. We had to immediately reduce capacity and reach out to our audiences. And what we did is we surveyed them to ask them what they would like to do, whether they'd like to keep their tickets, with the caveat that if demand exceeded supply, we would seat them by order date. They could have a full refund. They could also have priority seating for Nutcracker 2022, or they could just keep their money on account to any show that we have either this season or next season, or make a donation. So we gave that as an offer to people. 70% of people wanted to keep their seats. So we were actually madly having to cancel seats. Then on Sunday, December 19th, we had our first case of COVID in the company. It was one case. And in the whole 2 years leading up to that, because we've been testing our dancers, I hear you, Sandra, with the test. It was our first positive test. So the decision was made to cancel that show while we got the PCR result, and also tested the close contacts, because as you know, in dance, we are talking about close contact. So it was a mad dash, as you can imagine, for the communications team. We got the emails out about the canceled shows, and we joined the Four Seasons Center staff, just greeting people, the few people that did not get the email. I will say the audience is amazing. Very few people, they were very disappointed, but they really understood what the situation was here, especially when they heard it was an artist who tested positive. And then on Tuesday, the 21st, we had our second test. It was in the orchestra. And then we just made the difficult decision to cancel the show. And so once again, here we are, the email machine. We got all the emails out to everybody, and offering the same thing, minus the keep your seats, obviously. And interestingly enough, 79% of people chose to select the full refund. This is in stark contrast to the 2021 season, where only 15% of audiences chose the refund. So it does speak, it is a different audience, the Nutcracker. The 2021 season was mainly our subscribers, but I do think there's a bit of fatigue out there. What have I learned? What have I learned from this? I would say, really, you have to just go with the flow and do your best. I found I have an amazing team that again and again went above and beyond to make all of this happen. But the other thing was for us in all of our communication, and I hear what you were saying too, Alex, was to put the patron at the center of the communication. So in everything that we drafted, we thought about how it was received, how we can ensure that this, we used actually the saying, your safety is our foremost priority in much of our communication. And that's true. And same thing with the ventilation. Four Seasons Center has an amazing ventilation system, I have since learned. But we really reiterated the safety to make sure that they realize too, our diligence keeps them safe. And I will say in the House, there was very little pushback from any policy and a lot of support. So the impact of canceling Nutcracker, because the goal was a little lower than what we had, we will probably be entering into the winter and summer seasons, fingers crossed that they happen, at about 1.15 million behind, which I do not anticipate making up, because I have a feeling that we probably are looking at 50% capacities in March. But roller coaster is a really good way to describe it, Aubrey.
Yeah, I'm exhausted just hearing all the pivots. So my head's spinning. Good thing you're ballet dancers.
Yeah, I know. We're doing as many pirouettes as there are on stage. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So while we saw the data showed an increase in attendance to indoor events from August to December, I was hearing anecdotally, and I think a lot of other people were too, through the fall, that audiences were buying tickets to big name shows like the Nutcracker and concerts of, big stars, but were considerably more hesitant to come to lesser known shows. It seemed a bit like the public were balancing their perceived risk versus reward, and were really only willing to take that risk on something they felt was worth it. So Alex, I was wondering if you might comment on that and how we can encourage audiences to see a reward in more unfamiliar choices. Oh, you're muted.
You think by now we would have figured this out. I'm sorry. I won't use the word pivot because I agree with Belinda. I don't ever want to hear that word again. But one of the outcomes of having to do this, I think, has been an exercise in flexibility. And when I think about what it means for an arts organization to be flexible from a programming perspective, I think a lot about an organization's ability to have a portfolio approach to programming. I know museums have the ability to do this, and arts organizations are starting to wrap their heads around it. And by portfolio approach, I mean, for an arts organization, whether you're a producer or a presenter, having your big blockbuster show, having the smaller size shows, and knowing that at the end of the day, your organization will make it out of it by having presented a variety of different shows for different audiences with different budgets. And so one of the things I'm noticing is there are certainly folks in Calgary that have flocked to the big rock concerts because they just want to forget that COVID is even existing and they want to be with their friends. But we also can't undermine the folks that are being very careful, that do want to be physically apart and do want to be perhaps at a smaller show. And so one of the things that I think we have started to explore, and because we are a center with a variety of different companies and venue sizes, we're leaning into what it means to plan with this portfolio approach in ways that we haven't before. And mind you, not just within our building, but also through outdoor free programming and digital as well. And I'll give you an anecdote. We have a series at Arts Commons because, as well as being stewards of this complex, we're presenters as well. So we have different series. One of the series we did, we moved online virtually and marketed it. This is earlier on in the pandemic. The numbers tripled from what we would have normally accommodated physically in our theaters. 91% of those viewers were new to that series. and 54% of those viewers were new to Arts Commons. And so this portfolio, by thinking about our programming, whether it's institutionally or community-wise, as this portfolio approach, understanding that different series have different audiences and different organizations have different audiences, understanding that a rising tide lifts all boat. And when somebody comes to Arts Commons and they go see a show at the Calgary Phil, I would like them to leave knowing that if you like the show, you might want to check out something at Theatre Calgary, or you might want to check out something at the High Performance Rodeo. It's that Netflix effect. If you watched a movie and you like it, you might like these other 10. And so to me, it's about how do we get these series and these audiences to talk to each other? How do we cross-pollinate audiences? One of my favorite phrases to come out of COVID is this idea of cultural promiscuity. I know that arts organizations think about their audiences as their own. The average Calgarian is going to 10 different organizations, seeing 10 different shows, subscribing to 5 different organizations. So why are we not organizing ourselves accordingly? And so to me, this idea of, if somebody comes to a rock concert because they have a different threshold for what safety should look like, to be able to say, hey, we have the same air filtration system. You're going to be just as safe in this venue as in that one, whether you're listening to classical music or jazz. And take that audience and take that relationship and consumer confidence and help translate it into a deeper experience with the art form or with other art forms. So I think we have the benefit of living in a performing arts center where we have to communicate between organizations, but it's something that I would invite other organizations to think about is how do we collaborate with a neighbor institution that historically we would have been perceived as competitors? How do we share data? How do we share information? How do our box offices talk to one another? So that this idea of cultural promiscuity isn't just encouraged, it's actually incentivized. So I hope that's an example of how we've thought about our programming, acknowledged people's threshold for safety, and going back to your original question, yes, the blockbuster shows might attract a larger audience, but the blockbuster shows are also the ones that have a bigger benchmark for earned revenue. So sometimes, a blockbuster show at 75% capacity is not worth it as much as doing a smaller size show at 50%. So it's about that portfolio approach, not just from an audience and programming perspective, but also financially to say what's the perfect mix within our community so that we're acknowledging where people are at. And a lot of that might have to be free. And we've had to lean on contributed revenue in ways that we've never had to before in order to meet audiences where they're at, whether that's in their community outdoors or in their homes or on their screens via our digital work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to turn to Sandra for a response to this because, you don't run a venue with multiple spaces. You have a touring company, and your approach to programming with hesitant audiences. Are you going to be more conservative and rely on old favorites, or is there really a risk in actually not taking artistic risks?
There is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because artists are not able to travel like across provinces and come internationally, in a lot of ways, it's forced presenters to reconsider Canadian work, to reconsider Canadian companies, and I think which is very positive. And that being said, some of the online product being delivered has come from the archive. So one sees the old favorites, as well as there being some fresh, innovative, new digital material. But, I think this really presents this amazing opportunity that we have here to bring in true inclusivity, to bring in marginalized people, Indigenous, people of color. We're seeing how activism has reemerged from the margins and starting to take hold of the mainstream. And I guess my big question is, can we think outside of the box on all of this, but still think inside the circle? The Canadian circle. So I think there's just a wonderful opportunity to not only do art differently, because we talk a lot about disruption in the arts. Let's disruption. But nature is the biggest disruptor here and has sent us, into a tailspin. And sometimes, in those shards of confusion, we piece everything back together. and think more long-term, not just short-term, but 7-generational thinking into the future. I think there's a real opportunity to recalibrate, realign, to rethink, and to do big thinking here. So, I know medical science has been, really incredible in terms of responding to the worldwide crisis, but I would love to see more systemic change as well in how we treat each other, how we look after the community interests as a whole. This is a once in a lifetime chance, I believe it is, to re-engineer our social systems and therefore our economic and environmental responses, and not just retreat to colonial systems or stories that usually come from somewhere else other than Canada. So is there an opportunity to recenter or center Canadian stories, Canadian narratives, rather than downloading well-known Euro-Canadian work? Can we upload the stories from here, from this land, from this place, from this soil? And I just think, we just need a lot of big thinking to do that. But, for example, with the economy, there's other ways of thinking about economy. There's relational economy, for example, where wealth is not monetary, but based on relationships. There's social economy. There's other kinds of economy. And when we talk about prosperity, how can we have prosperity without including the well-being and the health of our land? We talk about arts ecology, but there's no eco in arts ecology. There's no eco in that really. Can we bring those worlds together in a way that is really, really innovative, exciting, and very much from this place, this powerful place called Canada? So is there a place to think of land as muse, in this? I just think there's also new possibilities for thinking about leadership differently, and in terms of Indigenous leadership, I think, we're missing the idea of prosperity altogether if we're disconnected from land. If we're disconnected from land, there is no prosperity.
Good segue, because my next question was actually about well-being. As the National Ballet experienced, all of our staff and artists are at risk of physical illness from COVID, while the endlessness of the pandemic is also causing a lot of mental health struggles and exhaustion, just simple exhaustion among our teams. And when so many organizations are already operating at low capacity, how do we support the well-being of our artists and our staff, while also managing short-term labor shortages that result?
Yeah.
So this could be for anyone who wants to jump in on this.
I would love to jump in. And Sandra, I want to thank you for those comments. I think one of the things that I would like to see more of is this redefining of excellence, and redefining of art centers as arbiters of excellence. Because the first thing I when I hear that phrase, my first question, and sometimes I never say it out loud, which needs to change. My first question is excellence according to who? And I think that to me is a huge part of what we need to be questioning. Aubrey, to your question, I think we need to, on behalf of Arts Commons, I do want to thank the Government of Canada, the Emergency Wage Subsidy Program. Without that program, we would not have been able to keep, as you mentioned earlier, 93% of our staff employed, and that brain trust alive, because I think one of the things that has resulted in organizations not being able to seize this moment is having to lose that brain trust and the staff that you are surrounded with. At Arts Commons, we put in place a very interesting protocol, and I've shared this with, I know, some of the folks on the call. So when our business was interrupted, or our business as commonly known with shows in venues as traditional presentations, we retained 93% of the staff, and we asked everybody, is there, it's almost like this, informational chart. If you did this, then do this. So the first question is, has your job been impacted by the pandemic? And in some cases, the answer was no, because all of a sudden our facilities teams, they had access to venues like they've never had before. So there are some folks on our staff that were busier than ever. others not so much. So if your job had been impacted by COVID, then the first question became, are you able to leverage your expertise or your skills to help somebody else in a different department? If the answer was yes, that's great. If the answer was no, can you help somebody within a resident company? If the answer was no, then we were encouraging our staff to volunteer within the community so that they were doing it on their salaried time at Arts Commons, but going out and helping within the community. I think one of the things that we learned from a programmatic perspective, and I think this goes back to an earlier question, is paying attention and focusing on what it means to be local and local impact. And I think a lot of organizations have this global ambition. And sometimes under normal circumstances, or certainly pre-COVID, this sense of prioritizing global reputations over local impact has come back to bite us now that we don't have access to travels and tours. And I think organizations' ability to focus on the local artist community and say, okay, I can't bring in a dance company from Europe, but there's a local artist community in Calgary that is hurting. The gig economy has dried up. So how can we take a lot of the grants that we had, the sponsorships that we had, and instead of saying we can't do this show, would you mind transferring the money to next year, or would you consider not taking the money back? We said we want to take the funds that have been allocated and invest it into the local artist community, whether that's engaging artists in the creation of new works, whether that's engaging local artists in these, in the pop-up concerts we did around the 4 quadrants of Calgary. The need was so intense and so local. I think hopefully what comes out of this globally, because it has leveled the playing field for every community around the world, is that arts organizations have learned to pay attention to local need and to their local impact in ways that perhaps we haven't before.
Okay. Belinda, did you want to respond to that? Or?
I can speak to what happened at the National Ballet. I think when this first happened, very much the focus of the executive team was, how do we keep everybody employed? Many, especially in the ballet world, internationally, many companies laid off their dancers. And I can say that the National Ballet of Canada did not lay off one dancer or any full-time staff. We all took a wage cut to keep everybody employed. And that was very much, it really was how we can together as an organization. I know many other organizations don't have a resident company, and we do. So it was to, how can we keep the dancers training? So each dancer was shipped a piece of Marley floor that they could continue their training in their home. And as soon as they could, they were in the studios in little pods, and we had markings on the floor for social distancing, temperature checks, everything to try and get them to train, because these are not just artists, they are elite athletes, they have to train. So that was made a priority, and the dancers actually were made a priority. So all the staff worked from home to make sure that it was as safe as possible for the dancers. The other thing for me is communication, that we committed to having town halls, full company town halls, where Barry Hewson, our executive director, just told everybody what was happening, good, bad, ugly. He just told everybody what was going on, and also spoke of what the priority of the organization was, and how important it was that we stick together. And the other thing we did is we worked with a psychiatrist that came in and really worked with us about burnout and understanding what burnout was, and about how to understand the pandemic fatigue, and about psychological health in the workplace. And that was really important for all of us to see. And that burnout thing was a big wake-up call for a lot of us, because we were like, wow, yes, check, 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 check. And that actually led to a little bit of a step back. And when, Alex, what you say about that, what is excellence? Because we are all type A people that strive for that excellence. We see it on stage, and everybody in the National Ballet strives for the level of excellence that we see on stage in everything we do. And sometimes we have to say, you know what, we actually can't do that right now. Becoming a full film production company and creating all that digital content was exciting, but really exhausting. And to me, it was really, really important to keep the audiences engaged throughout, that we actually could offer something. And it was really important for our artists and for our artistic leadership to actually create some art. But it's true, the balance is important. But I'm glad we have pretty good retention for staff. We did lose a few people who got offered a lot more money. It's in this world now, but I'm happy to say that we have a lot of people still with us, still hanging in there with the National Ballet.
That's good. It feels like a lot of people are really doing some self-assessment of what they can let go of, like what is actually the core priorities of our organizations, and what was all nice to have but not essential. Last week, Mitchell Marcus, the CEO of the musical stage company, published a really detailed blog post breaking down the financial costs and complexities of closures for his organization. And he explained how government subsidies, like the wage subsidy that you were talking about, Alex, was enormously important to ensuring the survival of arts organizations. But I quote, "Keeping art alive is not the same as keeping arts organizations alive." And he argued there's some pretty huge financial risks ahead for reopening and for getting art produced and presented. So for all of you, what are the risks ahead that weigh most heavily on you, and what support could help to mitigate those risks? Stumped you all.
I think for me, it is that it's continuing, that we got to keep people employed. And we have done a lot of analysis on when you look at the season, and I know Mitchell has this in there, like when you look at the cost of a production, and sometimes depending on what capacities are, and Alex spoke to this too, sometimes it's just not worth it, that you then have to rethink programming to say, if we are at X capacity, if we only have X amount of dancers healthy, can we do this? And we have to make some tough decisions there. So that's kind of what keeps me up at night, is can we actually get through what we have programmed, and can we continue to support our employees, our artists and our employees? And I'll echo too, without that wage subsidy, I don't think the National Ballet would have made it either. So we're very grateful to the Canadian government for that.
And I'll echo Belinda. One of the things that keeps me up at night is, and I see this, at least, I feel so grateful and hopeful, which is a weird thing to say. I compare, our realities in Canada with the realities of our neighbors in the South in terms of their arts organizations, and not having the support mechanisms that we have in place. But my concern is that the support mechanisms will fade faster than consumer confidence will rebound. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that juggling act becomes, how do we advocate for these mechanisms to stay in place at the same rate with which our business will bounce back? But to an earlier point that Sandra made, how do we rethink our business so it's not just going back to normal, or it's not taking the season that we had planned to present in 2018 or 2019, but it's also understanding that we need to do business differently, and how we mitigate risk needs to be completely reimagined. I know, I said this back in 2008, 2009, and it wasn't a very popular opinion, but, when I was in New York in 2008, 2009, that crisis, so many theater companies went under. And in hindsight now, when I look at those theater companies, I said, those are companies that thought they could coast through the pandemic. Those are organizations that thought they could lay low and wait for this to pass. And the organizations that made it through were the organizations that made bold artistic decisions with a very conservative understanding of risk mitigation. So I think it's that balance of saying, how do we lobby for these support systems to understand the art sector? And it's not just a flip of the switch, like perhaps, the restaurant sector or the tourism sector. Our businesses are very unique, and we will bounce back at a very different speed. How are we relating that nuance to government so that in their wisdom, they can continue these programs, and not necessarily in a way that gives the arts sector a bailout, but that understands that we will come back at a different rate. But also, how are we being held accountable as leaders and organizations to think about programming differently, to think about the urgency of connecting with communities differently, And this idea that if you build it, they will come, I would like to think is gone forever. Arts organizations will have to work so much harder to regain the confidence and the consumer confidence of audiences. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I would like to see that urgency in all of us to do the work and to collaborate in new ways, because audiences will be tired, there will be fatigue, there will be financial constraints. That's not their problem, it's our problem. And so how are we doing things differently? So that would be my response.
Yeah. Sandra, I think you were writing stuff down, so I feel like you've got some responses.
I'm writing down some thoughts. Definitely thinking about programming differently to mitigate risk. We've really interested and excited by the digital space, I have to say, and in terms of the innovation and what that could mean, and actually reaching, a lot of people through that, and as well as keeping live performance going in the future. What keeps me up at night, sort of thing, is like, will this tour happen? We're having another tour coming up on February 7th, and there's a part of me saying, is it going to happen? Is it going to happen? So far, so good. It's going forward. But and we've just been touring like gangbusters, and of all the years to be doing this much touring, but so far, so good. Knock on wood. I'm just wondering, just a thought, and I think about, when Marcia McLuhan was talking about, the power of the arts to anticipate future social and technological developments, when I think he dubbed Ezra Pound saying, artists are like the antenna, we can sort of, the antenna of the race, the antenna for a society. I mean, it might be interesting to hear directly from artists as well about what the future is, because I just think that'd be really, really, really interesting. If we are the antenna of a society, what if we hear directly from artists as opposed to always hearing from just, not just, I should say, because I'm one, but, executive directors and, marketing people. It'd be great to hear from the artists themselves on this topic. And I think it'd be really, really interesting.
We have a lot of really good questions coming from our audience. So I think I'm going to wrap up our moderated discussion at this point and welcome Erin, who has got the questions from the audience.
Hi. So I'm going to start our question and answer period today by asking if Nik Nanos wants to join us. There was a question for him, which is basically Robin was asking if he has presented these research results on media platforms, saying that talking amongst ourselves is important, but we're constantly making the public aware of the situation. So talking among ourselves is important, however, constantly making the public aware of the situation with museums/galleries is critical. So Nik, if you'd like to answer that question, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Thanks, Erin. And as some of you know, the Globe and Mail has been very supportive of business and arts, and have referenced the material. I have managed to write like full page op-eds on this. And Aubrey, I haven't told you this, but I did do a pitch for this week to try to put a spotlight on this, because I think the fact that, and we also have to remember that we're getting to that time of year where people start focusing on mental health. And I think talking about the Omicron virus, what it means to people, culture, what's happening in the cultural sector, the role of the culture sector, not just in its, I'll call it core mission of delivering great experiences, art and culture experiences, but we know from our research, supporting better mental health. And actually, and I don't even want to use words like if there's a silver lining, because it's kind of bizarre, but what we do know from our research that we've done, for example, for the Arts Council in British Columbia, is that people are increasingly connecting their mental well-being and their mental health with participating in arts and culture activities. And so yeah, Erin, to the question, we are pitching it. I'm hoping that we can get more profile on this, because it's important to keep this on the forefront for everyone.
Quebec Le Devoir has also done quite a bit of coverage about the art sector and these issues and the data. Okay, on to our next question.
Great, thank you for that. So the next question that we have is for Alex. And the question from Marilyn is, can you share about Arts Commons Indigenous strategic planning process? Our board is beginning this process and I'm interested in learning from your experience. As we re-emerge, issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion seem highly relevant.
Absolutely, that's a great question. And I will say that it's a very organic process, and I probably shouldn't even be the one sharing it, but I'm happy to talk about our experience as an institution. Last summer, as you know, undoubtedly these topics of diversity, equity, inclusion are coming up. I'm relatively new to Calgary, and so when I started leaning into these topics, a very good mentor of mine said, listen, it's one thing for you to come from New York with the work that you've been doing there. It's another thing for you to now be in Canada and now be in Calgary. You need to understand these topics through the lens of what it means to be a Calgarian. And so I turned to as a performing arts center, I actually looked to library systems as what I would like our future to look like when it comes to organizations that have redefined their relevance, that have increased access to and have redefined their value proposition to the cities. I think libraries, those that have succeeded, are doing far better at it than the arts sector. And for those of you that know Calgary, we have one of the best libraries in the world. So I did turn to the social service sector and to partner institutions that have already been having this conversation. And I learned that United Way of Calgary and the University of Calgary had started this process. And so I sat down with them and I said, what did it look like? Who did you talk to? How could we do our own version of this? So we have been having regular meetings with Indigenous elders from a variety of different First Nations from the region, talking about, or not even talking, me listening and my staff and board members listening to the parallels that exist between Indigenous ways of knowing and Western ways of doing business. And in having these conversations, I imagine different things would pop up for each one of us, but things that have resonated for us, the three parallels that we are leaning into as an organization, and this will take years to manifest. But this idea of sanctified kindness being why we do what we do. And when you look at the ceremony of lighting a smudge, it's that idea of celebrating sanctified kindness. Well, that's what we do in our venues, in our theaters, and in front of the arts all day, every day. So how do we learn from that? The second parallel is this idea of building relatives, and that building relatives, as I learned it to be, transcends this idea of allyship and partnership. And yes, being an ally and being a partner is important, but building relatives is even more important. And isn't that what we do when we sit together and watch art together? And so how do we learn from that? And then the third one for me is this idea of a social business. And that and Sandra was speaking to this earlier about, there are different types of economies. There are different types of defining wealth. And this idea that a social business turns our perceived identity of how we govern ourselves, it turns it upside down. And what I find particularly interesting for me is that in the arts world, we talk about our social product. So the output of what we do is inherently a social product. Why isn't how we do it governed by social practices? And so it's not necessarily what we put on stage. That will change over time if we do it right. But this idea of being a social business is, how do we govern ourselves differently? How do we take care of each other differently, so that how we do things changes alongside with what we do and what we put out there? So Marilyn, that's just my version of this. My hope, if you lean into this with your board, is that your process will be as unique as the mission of your institution.
Great, thank you for that. So I think I'm going to end with one final question, and I think this is kind of an interesting question for our panel to consider as we move forward this year. So the question that we have here is, can our panel address if we're just tweaking our old models, waiting for all of this to pass and go back to business as usual, or are we transforming the way that we work and think for the future? Would anybody like to take a stab at this one?
I'll jump in only because I don't want to have the final word. There are different strategies and approaches to change management. And there was some question or comment about change management at Arts Commons. I think you need to bring everybody into the tent, redefine the narrative, build community that way, and have that change management be a collaborative and a community-driven process. I have worked for institutions that have taken a very different approach, and I have worked for CEOs that have started for institutions and they wipe the slate clean and they say, I'm going to start from scratch. And that idea of burning down the house, I think, has a place and particularly when you talk about activism and the relationship between arts and activism. I think there is sometimes a place for that. But when I think about arts, when I think about change management, I think about this is a long burn. Anything that happens overnight can just as easily be taken away overnight. So the fact that I've been here now 2 years almost, I also say jokingly that COVID has allowed me to do things in 6 months that would have taken me 3 years normally. So, but still approaching that change management from a collaborative perspective, and realizing that, and to Sandra's point earlier, we might be arts organizations, but we need to be surrounded by artists. I even tell my senior team sometimes, you need to be better at what you do than I do. This idea of leaning into others for what change looks like. And again, it was a very humbling moment for me to move to Calgary and say, I think I know what questions to ask, but I don't know the answer because I've never lived here long enough. So how can I ask the question and bring people together so that we're answering them in a way that is relevant and unique to Calgary? So that's my approach to change management. And thank you for asking the question.
I think we are going to have a much more collaborative future. I can see that, and a less top-down management style. I can see that I think it's not just the arts. I think that we're learning this. I don't think our workers will accept the way it was before. So I see a future of more equity, and that work is so important. And I just don't think we will not go back to the before times, but I would just love this to be over and our theaters to be full, but I think we will have different companies after this.
And I think there's a real opportunity to look at these models that are somewhat flawed and to be able to rethink them. And not only just in terms of physical structures, but also in the digital space, that we're not just merely building now into a digital space the same flaws that are within the institutions. And does that space, digital space, does it have to be a colonial space? Can it be another kind of space other than, and then can that digital space then come back and inform the physical structures and the physical institutions, which I think it can. I just want to say one thing around when we talk about mental wellness and well-being and how important that is, and it's such an important conversation. But can I just say this, how can we think about, human well-being when the air is not clean, when the water's not clean? We have to breathe that air, we have to drink that water. So when we think about well-being, I think it has to be a much bigger picture and not just a human-centric notion of well-being. Mm-hmm.
I think if I could just add really quickly, we're probably, and just looking at the numbers, we're looking at an evolution, not a revolution. And the thing is that people want and need their art and culture experiences, and they've been experimenting with online. And what the research suggests is they're still going to go back to those in-person experiences because there's nothing to replace that in-person shared experience that can transform, educate, and connect people. But online is going to be part of the mix.
And the revolution that is happening, happening.
Yes.
Of the evolution.
Yeah. Yes. And exactly. And I think we need to be thinking in terms of permanent resiliency that includes all of these things, mm-hmm. so that patrons can engage on their terms when they want, that they're going to want that in-person experience, but that online will be part of that for certain other types of experiences.
Can I just say the live experience is what it is all about. And I think that has proven us, even though we've all done amazing digital work, it is not the same. And it's what we do is live performance and human connection.
And Belinda, I want to, and Belinda, please, somebody say something after me, because I really don't want to have the last word. But I do think that talking about change, organizations that don't change or that are looking at change as a lipstick, as an exercise is put it, those are the organizations that are not going to be around in 5 years. There is an urgency to figuring it out, and it's messy, and organizations that are trying to change are struggling, and we are all struggling. And organizations that are, again, like I said earlier, that are laying low, those are the organizations that are not going to be around. So it's not that, oh, this is something that we should be doing because it's good management. There is an urgency to this. The world is changing, and if we don't change with it, we're going to be out of business. And if that's not a wake-up call, then I don't know what is. Please, somebody say something after me.
I would concur. There is an urgency. There's a big fire under us now. Yeah.
Time's up.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. I'm just going to ask our Business and Arts Chair, Robert Foster, to give our final closing words of thanks. But it's been a delight. Thank you.
Thank you. Which?
Emotion, thoughtful, strong. Those are the three words that came to my mind listening to you. The emotion is what you gave to the audiences. I had shivers listening to you as to how they reacted. Belinda, we were there for Crystal Pipe. You did not exaggerate. It was amazing. And that's what you are all giving us as members of the audience. You're thoughtful as leaders, and that was clearly demonstrated today. You're strong as leaders. And you really are an exceptional group. I like to say leaders lead from the front, they're first over the hill. And you all are. You really are. You know, we exist to serve the artist, as was indicated by all of you. That's why we're here. And we're here to show the best that we can for the people that participate through preferably live audiences. We were very fortunate to have the three of you. Sandra, I've known for some time. I hold her in high regard. I just like her as a person. She's a great woman. Doing an amazing job with Red Sky. Alex, congratulations on Arts Common. It's a marvelous organization. I knew your predecessor well through the summits. And it sounds like you are doing a rocket ship job managing a tough situation. And Belinda, we've been fans and supporters forever at the ballet. Karen Kane has co-chaired things with me. I have that, and I know Barry well. So I have the highest regard for the whole organization, and it's a joy to meet you and listen to your story. I would be remiss if I didn't also say how delighted business and the arts, and I think the whole community is, to have Aubrey Reeves as the CEO of our organization. Aubrey is doing an outstanding job and makes it easier for all of us. I understand there's something over 700 people on today. It's just amazing how our community, our sector, is anxious to learn and hear from one another. We look around how we rally. The National Arts Center under Christopher Dean and Jane Watson have been wonderful supporters, and in fact initiated the whole work that Nik Nanos is doing. And Nik, as you can tell, has a real passion about what he is doing for us. He cares, and he's a real participant. It's not just a job. So we're thrilled to have Nik. He's also a very likable guy, which makes it easier for all of us. So a shout out to the National Arts Center for their leadership. David Bennett, who's on our board, and a wonderful guy whose son is Robert Bennett. And so it's amazing how the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, although I don't think David was ever a dancer, but he's a wonderful guy and supportive. Christine Armstrong, who at one time was a team member of our organization, your friend Raji, who's on our board and a great supporter, Calgary-based, belongs to Alex's community. He used to be here, and I knew him professionally here. Power Corp are great supporters of the arts. They care about the arts. We are blessed to have Paul Genet from Power Corp on our board. Paul and I ski together occasionally. We see one another. We have chalets not very many feet apart. So that's fortunate for all of us that we have our arms around him, and we're not going to let him go, I can assure you. Manulife cares about our sector. We've had strong support from them, as has the whole sector, for a long time. I know a lot of the Manulife people deal with them. So again, you go through these names and there's a reason they're all there. They care and they share and they participate. So I look at all this and I just feel blessed to be part of it. It's really an honor to work with all of you, to do all of this. And I want to end with a great big thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.